Okay, so this is the key to worksheet 13.6 part A, and on this worksheet you're solving each quadratic equation by factoring. All right, so remember a quadratic equation has this form, ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Now, in these quadratic equations that you see in part A and in part B, the equations are factorable. Now, in a future section, some of these equations will not be factorable, so you're going to use the quadratic formula. But in this case, always read directions. Directions says you must solve by factoring. Most of you know the quadratic formula. Make sure you follow direction. Direction says factoring. Okay, so you must do this by factoring. All right, so in number one, this if you were to multiply this out, you would see that that is a quadratic equation because 3x times 2x is 6x squared. So the fact that the larger exponent is 2 makes this quadratic. But it's already factored. So remember, we're going to use the zero factor property. So the zero factor property basically says that if you have two factors whose product is 0, then one of these must be 0. All right, so basically what you do is you're going to look at these two factors. So those are my two factors. And so I'm going to set them equal to 0 using the zero factor property, just like this. All right, and then you notice you went from a quadratic equation to two linear, and you just solve the linear equations and you get your solutions. So you'd say 3x equal 1 and x is 1/3. So that's one of your solutions over here. Subtract 5 from both sides to get 2x equal -5. And then divide both sides by 2. And so my other solution is -5/2. All right, so those are your two solutions. So x equal 1/3 and x equal -5/2. All right, and so if you were to check, if you were to take, let's say 1/3, and let's plug it into here. So 3 times 1/3 is 1. 1 minus 1 is 0. And so no matter what this is, when x is 1/3, 0 times this is still 0. Okay? And do the same thing with this. To get the 0, you would have to substitute into both, but you notice that this will be 0. Because 2 times a -5/3, 2 times a -5/2, I'm sorry, is -5. -5 plus 5 is 0. And 0 times whatever this is would be 0. Okay, number 2 is already factored as well. Okay, but sometimes this gets students a little confused because it doesn't look like this where you have two binomials. You see that? You have a monomial times a binomial. It doesn't matter. You can consider this one factor and you can consider this one factor. And so if I set -5x equal to 0 and then x minus 5 equal to 0 and then get x by itself here, to do that I would have to divide both sides by -5. And so -5 divided by -5 is 1. 1 times x is x. And then 0 divided by -5 is 0. So there's one of my solutions, 0. Over here, to get x by itself, I'm going to add 5 to both sides. So I get x equal 5. So there's the other solution. All right. And again, make sure it says show all work and make sure all statements are mathematically correct. All right, number three, this is not factored, so you have to factor this. So let's go ahead and factor this. And notice the GCF here is 1. I always look for that as well. All right, so get x, 6 and 3 is going to work for 18. And the last sign's negative, so that means that these signs are different, and 6 would have to be negative, and 3 would have to be positive. All right, now remember, always check before you go 1. Make sure I get the -3x. The outer is 3x, the inner is a -6x, and when I add them up, I get -3x. So the first thing you have to do is factor. So the first step is to factor. The next step is to use the zero factor property. All right, so I'm going to set each factor equal to 0. There are two factors here. So I get x minus 6 equals 0, x plus 3 equals 0. And then add 6 to both sides. So notice I went from a quadratic equation to two linear. And so x equals 6 is one solution. And then the other one, subtract 3 from both sides to get x equal, and then 0 to -3 is a -3. All right. All right, number 4. Okay, so number 4, again, you have a quadratic equation. It is not factored, so we need to factor it. But notice, remember, the first thing you always have to do is look for a GCF. The GCF here is x. So I'm going to factor out the x, get x times x minus 5 equal 0. So that looks just like number 2, right? Number 2. Okay, so then I'm going to set each factor equal to 0. So step 1 was to factor in this case. All right. Now, the next step is to use a zero factor property. So if I have two factors whose product is 0, then one of these needs to be 0. That's the only way I can get a product of 0. So I set each one equal to 0, just like this. And then notice I went from a quadratic equation to linear, and I just solved for x. Well, x is already by itself here, so there's one of my solutions right there. The other one, to get x by itself, I'm going to add 5 to both sides, so there's my other solution. And again, you can check this. Let's check 5. What's 5 squared? You always go back to the original. What's 5 squared? 25. What's 5 times 5? 25. What's 25 minus 25? 0. All right, so that's how you can check. Okay, now look at number 5. Now remember, when solving a quadratic equation by using a zero factor property, it must be in standard form. Okay, you must have it in standard form, meaning that every term's on one side and zeros on the other. So step 1 in this case, see, that's not in standard form. So step 1 in this case has to be, let's put this in standard form. So I've got to bring the 3 to the other side. So I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides, and when I do that, I get 2x squared minus x minus 3 equals 0. Now this is in standard form. Okay, so remember, we have to get it in standard form. Okay, now let's factor. The GCF is 1, so I'm going to go directly to factoring. And then let's see what I get. 2x, 3 would have to go here, 1 has to go here. Last sign's negative, so these signs are different. And I want the middle sign to be negative, so that means this has to be negative, this has to be positive. All right, let's check. The outer is 2x, the inner is a negative 3x. When I add them up, I get negative x. All right, now, once you put it in standard form, and once you factor, remember the next step is to use the zero factor property. So I have two factors whose product is 0. The only way I can get a product of 0 is if one of these factors is 0. So let's determine what x makes one of these each factor equal to 0. So 2x minus 3 equals 0, x plus 1 equals 0. So I went from a quadratic equation to linear. All right, so over here I'm going to add 3 to both sides, so I get 2x equals 3. And to get x by itself, divide both sides by 2. 2 divided by 2 is 1. 1 times x is x. So one of my solutions is 3 halves. The other one, subtract 1 from both sides, I get x to be negative 1. The other solution is negative 1. Okay? And let's go ahead and check let's say 3 halves. I'm going to do this using a calculator. Let's just check. Now remember, you don't have to, okay? That's not necessary. Necessary. I'm spelling necessary wrong, but it's all right. Okay, so we go back to the original, because you could have made a mistake somewhere along the way. So you're going to say 2 times 3 halves squared minus 3 halves, and you want to see that's equal to 3. Just use your calculator. That's all you do. Just use your calculator. 2 times, in parentheses, 3 divided by 2, close the parentheses, I'm squaring it, right? And then I'm subtracting 3 divided by 2, press equal, and what do you get? 3, and that's what I wanted. Okay, so 3 is a solution. You can do the same thing with negative 1. With negative 1, you would say 2 times, in parentheses, negative 1 squared minus a negative 1, just like this, okay? And you want to see that's equal to 3. All right, so I get 2 times negative 1 squared minus, you're subtracting, all right, so 2, let me do it again. 2 times negative 1, and I'm squaring it, right? I'm subtracting, that's subtracting right here. So you got to press your subtraction symbol, but I'm subtracting a negative 1, so now you got to press the negative button. See how that looks? And then press equal, and you get 3. All right? All right. Okay, now number 6, again, what do you think step 1 is? Can I go directly to factoring? No, you got to put it in standard form. All right, so when I bring the 5x to the other side, the sign changes. So it'll be 3x squared minus 5x minus 2 equals 0. Now let's factor. So when I factor, I get 3x, and I need the 2 here, the 1 here. The last sign's negative, the signs in here are different, and I need the middle sign to be negative, the middle term to be negative, and so that means this is negative, this is positive. Let's check. A negative 6x is the outer, the inner is a positive x. When I add them up, I get negative 5x. All right, now the next step, once you factor, is to use a zero factor property. So I'm going to set each of these factors equal to 0 because their product is 0. If I have a product that's 0, then one of them has to be 0. So I'm going to set each factor equal to 0. And then notice these are linear equations, so I solve these linear equations. And so I get 3x equal to negative 1. And then I'm going to divide both sides by 3. 3 divided by 3 is 1. 1 times x is x. I get x to be a negative 1/3. So there's your other, one of your solutions for that one. The other one, you're going to add 2 to both sides. So x equal 2. There's the other solution. Okay? All right, so that's going to take care of worksheet 13.6, part A.